Picture a house clinging to a storm-lashed cliff, candles guttering while the sea argues below. Guests gather at a friendship retreat, and the proprietor is found dead in her locked writing room. A forged note, a tampered timetable, and a teacup ring on wet ink make quiet motives loud. In We Were Never Friends, suspicion circles the group as old shame resurfaces. Settle in. Secrets don't stay buried. Chapter 1. Briarcombe House. Briarcombe House clung to the Dorset cliff like a thing that had learned long ago not to look down. The storm had been building since noon. First a steady wetting of the air, then wind that pushed at hedgerows and turned the lane into a slick ribbon. By late afternoon, the sea below the house had become a single bruised color, its surface chopped into hard angles that flashed white where waves broke against black rock. Arthur Bell watched it from the window of the small sitting room that had been assigned to him, a thin blanket over his knees and a cup of tea that had gone cold in his hand. He had come to Briarcombe because his doctor had called it a place to breathe. Convalescence was a polite word. It meant the stare that left him short of breath, the stiffness in his chest that arrived like a rebuke, the sense that his body had become an unpredictable witness. From this height, the world looked simple. Sea, sky, stone. Behind him, the house spoke in its own language, the creak of old boards, the low groan of pipes, the distant clink of crockery as Mrs. Prowse, the proprietor, laid out supper as if weather were only a minor inconvenience. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock ticked with steady, officious confidence. A car crunched along the gravel drive. Then another. Arthur rose carefully and went to the hall. Briarcombe's entrance smelled faintly of beeswax and damp wool. Portraits climbed the walls, stiff-faced men in dark coats, women whose pale throats seemed too exposed to the draft. A row of hooks hung beside the door, each labeled in Marian Holt's tidy hand: front door, cellar, linen cupboard, writing room. Underneath them, pinned with 2 brass tacks, was a sheet of cream paper headed Briarcombe, Friendship Retreat, Timetable. The times were laid out in precise columns: tea, supper, quiet hours. A final line at the bottom: 10, house locked. Marian Holt stood near it, smoothing invisible dust from her cuff as if the paper required her care to stay straight. She was in her early 60s, hair silvered and pinned neatly at the nape, posture so correct it suggested she could be balanced on a ruler. She turned as the first guest entered. Eleanor Price, small and soft-voiced, carried her overnight bag with both hands as though it might drift away. Her eyes flicked to Marian's face, then down to the floor. When Marian reached to take her coat, Eleanor made a quick, unconscious motion, smoothing her skirt, flattening wrinkles that weren't there. "Eleanor," Marian said, as if the name were an appointment. "Marian." Eleanor's smile was careful. Behind her came Judith Crane, and the temperature of the hall seemed to drop by a degree. Judith's hair was a polished chestnut bob. Her coat was expensive and cut to flatter. Rings sat on her fingers like punctuation. She swept her gaze over the hall with brisk assessment and gave Marian a look that might have been warmth, if warmth had ever been Judith's native element. "The road was appalling," Judith said. "Your directions were optimistic." "The coast is uncooperative in bad weather," Marian replied. "You made it." The third arrival was Sylvia Bennett, who came in apologizing to the air itself, sorry for the mud on her shoes, sorry for the delay, sorry for existing inconveniently in a storm. Her hands were already busy, reaching for Eleanor's bag strap, offering to help Mrs. Prowse with coats. "Sylvia, you needn't," Marian began. Sylvia smiled without looking up. "It's habit." Then Clara Whitfield stepped over the threshold, pausing as if she had to ask permission from the house. She was taller than the others, thin, her hair braided and pinned in a way that was more anxious than fashionable. A small silver charm hung at her throat, and as Marian greeted her, Clara's fingers worried it, thumb and forefinger rolling it back and forth. Last came Rose Mallory, cheeks pink from the wind, eyes bright. She brought with her the faint scent of rain and lavender soap. She took in the hall with quick, curious glances and smiled at everyone as if the years between them were a story she intended to retell kindly. "There you all are," Rose said. "I was beginning to think Briarcombe would slide into the sea before we arrived." Mrs. Prowse's mouth tightened at that, but Rose only laughed softly and bent to unfasten her boots. Arthur stood slightly aside as he preferred. Marian introduced him with polite efficiency. "Mr. Bell is lodging with us for his health," she said. "A retired magistrate." Judith's gaze sharpened. "How useful!" Arthur inclined his head. "Only if you have the intention of misbehaving, Mrs. Crane." For the first time, Judith's mouth shifted into something like amusement. The women were guided into the drawing room, where the fire threw light against the storm-dark windows. The sea's roar was muffled here, reduced to a constant, distant breath. Marian handed out tea as if it were a sacrament. She sat slightly apart, her cup aligned with the edge of her saucer, her hands folded in her lap when she wasn't lifting it. Conversation was gentle at first. Weather, roads, how long it's been. It had the sound of a rehearsed performance, lines delivered with the right inflection, but no one truly listening. Rose told a story about her train being delayed behind a fallen tree. Sylvia asked after Eleanor's sister. Clara murmured something about the view. Judith corrected Marian once, softly, almost kindly, about the name of a village they'd passed. Marian accepted the correction with an expression that suggested she had always known and had simply been testing them. Later, when Rose rose to examine the photographs on the mantel, she drifted near the hall and paused. The corridor beyond was dim, and for a moment she thought she had heard her own name. It wasn't her name, it was Marian's voice, low and clipped, speaking to someone unseen. We agreed never to speak of it again. There was a beat of silence. Then another voice, cool, impatient, answered too softly for Rose to catch. Rose stepped back into the drawing room before she could be seen listening. She smiled at Sylvia and asked about the biscuits, as if her heart had not tightened around that one sentence. In the hall, the timetable fluttered slightly in a draught that smelled of wet leaves and salt. Chapter 2, Night Tea. By supper, the storm had put its shoulder against the house and begun to push. Rain struck the windows in hard, slanting lines. Wind worried the chimney and made the flames in the dining room's candles lean as though they, too, wanted to retreat. Mrs. Prowse served fish pie with a stern competence, her niece Lottie following with plates and a bowl of greens. The staff moved quietly, keeping their eyes down, as if they had learned that guests were more dangerous than weather. The women ate. At first, the talk stayed on safe ground. The food was good. The beds were comfortable. Marian had chosen the house well. Then Judith lifted her wine glass and said, "To old friends." It was meant to be a toast. It landed like a stone. Clara's fingers tightened around her charm. Eleanor's mouth pulled into a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Sylvia looked down as if searching her plate for a polite response. Rose's laugh filled the silence. "To surviving ourselves," she said lightly, and raised her glass. Marian's lips curved. "To truth," she said, and drank. Arthur watched them, cataloging tells the way he once cataloged witnesses. Judith spoke as if she were chairing a meeting, guiding topics, trimming digressions. Eleanor responded with careful niceness, never offering a detail that could be used against her. Sylvia asked questions and then apologized for asking them. Clara spoke in half-finished sentences. Rose bridged every gap with warmth, as though she believed warmth could patch a leak. Marian, at the head of the table, kept time. After the meal, as they lingered over coffee, Marian pressed a hand to her midsection and made a small displeased sound. "Still?" Sylvia asked at once. It was automatic, the nurse in her stepping forward. "You've been unwell?" Nothing dramatic. Marian waved a hand as if dismissing a child. "My stomach has been unreliable. Travel does it to me, or nerves, or age. Take your pick." "You should have said," Sylvia insisted. "It might be." "Indigestion," Judith cut in. "She's always been prone to it." Marian's eyes flicked to Judith. "Have I?" Judith's rings glinted as she reached into the small handbag beside her chair. "You used to complain of it after every committee dinner. Do you remember? The little bottles of drops you swore by." She produced a small amber bottle with a glass dropper. The label was plain. "Digestive drops." The handwriting was neat, but not Marian's. "You still carry those?" Rose asked, delighted. Judith shrugged as if it were nothing. "I dislike discomfort. 12 drops in tea. Works wonders." Marian's mouth tightened at the word 12, as if Judith had counted them personally. "You're not my physician," Marian said. "No," Judith replied. "I'm your friend." The word hung between them. Arthur saw Eleanor flinch. He saw Clara's eyes dart to Marian, then away. Sylvia watched Marian's hand on her stomach as though she could see through skin and bone. Rose's smile held, but her gaze sharpened. Marian took the bottle anyway. "Fine," she said, if only to avoid Sylvia's fussing. "Thank you." Judith's smile was quick and bright and gone. Later, as the others drifted toward the drawing room, Marian paused near the hall timetable and ran a finger down the list of times. "We will keep to this," she said. "If we keep to structure, we will not—" She stopped as if the rest of the sentence had teeth. "We will manage." Rose leaned in to read it. "Night tea at 9:40, she said. "Very civilized." Marian nodded. "I like night tea. It keeps the house quiet." Arthur noticed the writing room key on its hook beside the paper. It was a heavy old thing, brass dulled by years of hands. "The writing room?" he asked. "A small room at the end of the east corridor," Marian said. "I use it when I need to work." Judith's gaze went there, too. Arthur couldn't tell if it was curiosity or calculation. At 9:35, Marian excused herself. "I've letters to finish," she said. "You'll forgive me. Rose, do help yourself to the biscuits. Judith, if you must correct my timetable, do it quietly." Rose laughed, but it sounded uncertain. Marian walked down the east corridor with the steady gait of someone who expected the house to obey her. Arthur, passing later on the way to his room, saw her enter the writing room. The door was oak, painted a deep green that had worn away at the edges. Its lock was old, an iron rim lock with a catch that clicked when the door was pulled shut. Marian went in. The door stayed slightly ajar. Just after 10, Clara came out of the lavatory at the end of the corridor and paused, listening. Earlier, Arthur had seen Judith in the corridor with a small tray, 1 cup, 1 saucer, and the amber bottle of digestive drops held in her hand as if it belonged there. She had moved with quiet purpose, not toward her own room, but toward Marian's. Arthur, in his room with a book he wasn't reading, heard voices drift faintly through the wall, Marian's and another. Judith's. There was no shouting. There was something worse, restraint. Then the rim lock clicked. Arthur closed his book. A few minutes after that, a slip of paper appeared on the hall table, weighted with a small brass candlestick. Rose found it when she went to fetch a shawl. "Oh," she said softly, reading. "Marian says not to disturb her." She held it out. The note was brief. "Please don't knock. I'm working." "She's always been strict about her writing," Eleanor said quickly, almost gratefully. Sylvia peered at the handwriting. "It looks like hers." "Of course it does," Judith said. "Marian's hand is consistent. It always has been." Arthur took the note for a moment, not to challenge it, but to feel the paper between his fingers. The ink was dry. The strokes were confident. Too confident. He handed it back without comment and went to bed with the storm rattling the windows like a warning. Chapter 3. The Locked Door. Morning arrived without light. The sky was the color of tin. The sea below was still violent, throwing itself against the cliff as if it could break the stone out of sheer insistence. The wind had shifted, and the house seemed to lean into it, groaning now and then in protest. Arthur dressed slowly and made his way to breakfast. The dining room smelled of toast and strong tea. Mrs. Prowse's jaw was set in the way of someone determined not to be impressed by weather. The women were already there, clustered near the table. Marian's chair at the head was empty. Rose glanced at the clock. "She's late." "Perhaps she slept," Sylvia offered, though she didn't sound convinced. Judith's mouth tightened. "Marian doesn't sleep late?" Eleanor's fingers worried at her napkin. Clara stared at Marian's empty place as if it might fill itself if she watched long enough. Mrs. Prowse poured tea with brisk movements. "Mrs. Holt took no tray from me this morning," she said. "No one asked for night tea either, not from the kitchen." Rose blinked. "But," Judith cut her off, "she had her own tea. That's what the timetable said." Arthur watched Judith as she spoke. She glanced briefly toward the hall. "I'll fetch her," Sylvia said at once, rising. "No," Judith said. "Let me. Marian will be irritated if she's woken by a fuss." It was said lightly. It was also a claim of jurisdiction. Judith walked into the hall. Arthur followed at a distance that could be explained as curiosity and was, in truth, habit. The timetable still hung where Marian had pinned it. The keys still hung beneath, each aligned on its labeled hook. The writing room key was there, heavy and dull. Judith reached up and took it. Arthur saw the way her fingers curled around the brass, enclosing it as if she wanted its weight to be private. She walked down the east corridor. The others hovered behind Arthur now in a slow ripple of unease. Judith tried the writing room door with a firm hand. It did not open. She inserted the key, turned it, and opened the door. The smell that came out was not rot or blood. It was something quieter, cold ink, damp wool, the faint, bitter trace of tea left too long. Judith stepped in. Silence swallowed her. Then she made a sound, small, involuntary, and stepped back out, shutting the door quickly. She's... Judith's voice caught. She swallowed. She's dead. Rose pressed a hand to her mouth. Sylvia moved forward so quickly she nearly collided with Judith. Arthur put a hand out, firm. Wait. Judith looked at him sharply as though resenting instruction. I? Key, Arthur said and nodded toward it. Judith's gaze flicked down. She hadn't put it back on the hook. After a beat, she walked to the hall and returned the key to its place, setting it with care. Arthur watched the motion. When Judith stepped aside, Sylvia reached for the key. Arthur spoke again. Let me. He took it off the hook. The brass was faintly warm against his skin, as if it had been held and only just released. In the cold hall, with the storm pressing chill through every crack, the warmth was wrong enough to register like a lie. Arthur walked to the writing room and opened the door. Marian Holt sat at her desk as if she were still working. A lamp stood beside her, wick turned low. A sheet of cream paper lay in front of her, covered in her crisp handwriting. A pen rested near her right hand. A teacup sat too close to the page. Her head was tilted slightly, as if she had paused to think. Only the stillness was absolute, the kind of stillness that did not change, no matter how long you watched. Sylvia moved in behind him, her face going pale as she reached for Marian's wrist. She pressed 2 fingers there and waited. Her throat bobbed. No, she said softly. No pulse. Rose's breath came in a thin sound. Eleanor's eyes filled. Clara made a small noise like a hiccup and backed toward the door. Arthur stepped to the desk, careful not to touch more than he had to. The letter lay unfinished. Near the bottom of the page, a ring of tea stained the paper, cutting through a line of ink that had not fully dried. The ring had dragged the ink into a faint smear. Arthur leaned closer. At the top, Marian had written, Briarcombe House, 9:35 below, several paragraphs in her precise hand. Near the end, the handwriting shifted almost imperceptibly, tiny tremors in the downstrokes, a slight loss of certainty in the loops. Arthur's gaze moved to the teacup. The tea inside was cold and dark. A faint residue clung to the porcelain at the rim. He straightened. Mrs. Prowse, he called. His voice carried into the corridor. How long since the phone worked? Mrs. Prowse appeared in the doorway, her apron already stained with breakfast. It crackled at dawn, she said. Now it's dead. The line goes over the lower lane, the storm. And the road? Gone, Mrs. Prowse said flatly. The bank slid in the night. You won't get a car through. The house felt suddenly like a hand closing. Arthur looked at the women. Until help can reach us, he said, this is a closed room. Whatever happened to Mrs. Holt happened with us here. Judith lifted her chin. Are you accusing us? I'm stating a fact, Arthur replied. No one came in from the sea. No one walked through a washed-out road, and Mrs. Holt did not lock herself in a room to die as neatly as that without a reason. Sylvia stared at Marian's face, her expression torn between grief and professional assessment. It could have been her heart, Sylvia whispered. Arthur's eyes returned to the teacup ring on wet ink. Perhaps, he said, but we will not assume. Chapter 4, Testimony. They moved Marian gently to the bed in the nearest guest room. Sylvia insisted on washing Marian's hands. Rose fetched a blanket. Eleanor stood in the doorway, smoothing her skirt again and again, as if her own composure could be ironed flat. Arthur left the writing room as it was, closing the door until the rim lock clicked into place. He returned the key to the hall hook himself, making sure it sat exactly where Marian had labeled it. Then he asked Mrs. Prowse to keep everyone in the drawing room while he spoke to them, one by one. The storm made conversation a private thing. Every pause was filled by the sea's roar and the wind's constant complaint. Arthur began with Rose, because she was the least guarded. Rose sat in the wing-back chair closest to the fire, but she didn't relax into it. Her hands were clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. You found the note last night, Arthur said. Yes, Rose whispered. On the hall table, it said not to disturb Marian. Did you see her write it? No. Did anyone? Rose shook her head. Judith said it was Marian's handwriting. Arthur watched Rose's face. Do you agree? Rose hesitated. It looked like Marian's, I suppose, but I didn't look closely. Why would I? Arthur nodded. Tell me about the sentence you overheard. Rose's eyes widened. Then, slowly, she nodded once. In the corridor, she said. Yesterday afternoon, Marian said. Her voice dropped. She said, we agreed never to speak of it again. Who was she speaking to? I didn't see, Rose admitted. I stepped back. I didn't want. She swallowed. I didn't want to be caught eavesdropping. Arthur let the words settle. Next was Clara. Clara perched on the edge of a chair as if she feared leaving a dent. Her fingers worked the charm at her throat until the silver flashed. You were awake late, Arthur said. Clara's gaze dropped. I couldn't sleep. The wind. Where did you go? Clara's throat tightened. To the lavatory. At the end of the east corridor. And? Clara's eyes flickered toward the door. I saw someone, she whispered, near Marian's door, crouched like they were putting something under. Arthur's tone stayed gentle. Could you tell who? Clara shook her head quickly. No, it was dark, and I was frightened. I went back to my room and locked it. Did you hear voices? Clara hesitated. Earlier, yes, Marian's voice and someone else. Judith? Clara didn't answer, but her silence answered anyway. Eleanor came next, and her politeness was so pronounced it felt like armor. I didn't do it, she said before Arthur had asked. Arthur let that hang a moment. Where were you at 9:35? Eleanor's eyes darted. In the drawing room with Rose and Sylvia and Clara. We were playing cards. And Judith? She came and went, Eleanor said. She always does. She likes to manage. Arthur watched Eleanor smooth her skirt again. You went into the east corridor. Eleanor stiffened. Only once. I realized I'd left my shawl in the dining room. I passed Marian's door. It was... She licked her lips. It was closed. Did you knock? Eleanor shook her head. The note said not to disturb her. Sylvia's interview was the most difficult because her grief came with guilt. I should have insisted, she said, eyes shining. When she set her stomach, when she held herself like that, I've seen that before. Not just indigestion. Sometimes it's the heart. Sometimes it's... Arthur's voice stayed firm. What did you see? Sylvia swallowed. At supper, she was pale. Not dramatically, but she looked tired. And after coffee, she pressed her hand to her abdomen. It could have been nerves. Did you know about the drops? Sylvia nodded. Judith offered them. Marian took the bottle. Did you see Marian take any? No. I assumed she would. She likes routines. Arthur saved Judith for last. Judith sat straight-backed, hands folded, rings aligned. If she was frightened, she wore it like a brooch. You found her, Arthur said. Judith's eyes hardened. I checked on her, because no one else would do it without fussing. Marian hated fuss. You took the writing room key. It was on the hook, Judith said sharply. As it should have been. Marian was always conscientious about keys. Arthur did not argue. What time did you last see her alive? Judith's gaze shifted a fraction, then steadied. Shortly after 9. She said she was going to write. I told her not to overwork. She was keyed up. Arthur gestured toward the hall timetable. The timetable says night tea at 9:10. Judith's mouth tightened. Marian's times were flexible. Arthur walked to the hall and returned with the paper itself, holding it by the edges. Were they? He asked. Judith's eyes flicked to it. She wrote it. If it says 9:10, then it was 9:10. Arthur's gaze dropped to the line. The ink was Marian's, black even, her distinctive neatness. But the 1 in 9:10 was darker, pressed into the paper with a different confidence. There was a faint scuff, the pale roughness left by an eraser, and beneath it a ghost of indentation, like the top of a 4 that refused to disappear completely. Did she rewrite this? Arthur asked softly, or did someone else? Judith's rings clicked once against each other as she adjusted them. Are you suggesting I altered a timetable in the night like a schoolgirl? How absurd. Arthur placed the paper back on the hall table and did not answer. Absurd was rarely the same thing as impossible. Chapter 5, Ashen Ink. The storm tightened its grip by afternoon. Wind came in bursts, rattling the windows so hard the glass trembled in its frame. The house's electricity flickered twice, hot lamps dimming and brightening with a faint whine. Mrs. Prowse lit extra candles without comment. Arthur asked Mrs. Prowse for Marian's papers. She had a leather portfolio, Mrs. Prowse said. Always brought it down with her. She didn't leave it in the writing room when guests were about. Where is it now? Mrs. Prowse frowned. It isn't in her room, and it wasn't in the writing room this morning. That, Arthur thought, was a second theft inside the first. He returned to the writing room alone, taking the key from the hall hook and noting again the lock's mechanism. The iron rim lock sat on the inside of the door. From the hall, you needed the key to turn the bolt and open it. But the bolt itself was only a catch. When the door was pulled shut, it latched into place. Privacy, not prison. The desk was neat, but not Marian's usual neatness. Papers stacked too precisely, the pen aligned too perfectly. Whether that was Marian's habit or an attempt to imitate it, Arthur couldn't yet say. He lifted the teacup carefully. The saucer left a pale ring of moisture beneath it. The letter lay where it had been. He read more of it now, eyes moving over Marian's cramped certainty and the slight tremor at the end. It was not a confession. It was a list. Names, dates. A single name repeated twice, underlined so hard the paper had been scored. Lillian Shaw. Arthur set the page down and looked around. The fireplace on the far wall held a small heap of ash. The grate was cold. It had not been lit, yet the ash smelled faintly of paper. Arthur leaned closer. Among the gray flakes he saw a fragment, curled and blackened, with the faintest trace of ink on it. Someone had tried to burn something here. He straightened slowly. As he turned, the lamps in the writing room flickered and went out. For a moment, the house was plunged into a dim that was not darkness, but something close. The storm outside howled like an animal at a door. Arthur stood still. Then behind him, a soft scrape. He moved quickly, quicker than his chest preferred, and caught the edge of the curtain as it shifted near the window. No one was there. But the air held the faint, sharp smell of scorched paper, stronger now, as if someone had passed close with it on their hands. The lamps blinked back on. Arthur went to the corridor and looked down. Footsteps, he thought. Someone had been here. He returned to the hall and found the women waiting in the drawing room, faces pale in candlelight, eyes too bright. Rose's gaze flicked to his hands. Is there anything she wrote?" she asked. Arthur held the letter up, just enough for them to see it existed. "There is," he said, "and someone has tried to destroy it." Judith's jaw set. Eleanor's eyes widened. Sylvia pressed a hand to her mouth. Clara's fingers went to her charm. "Who would do that?" Rose whispered, though her voice suggested she already knew. Arthur's gaze rested on the hall timetable, its altered number staring back like a small deliberate defiance. "Someone who feared what she planned to say," he replied. He turned to Sylvia. "You said you'd seen things like Marian's discomfort before. If it wasn't indigestion, what was it?" Sylvia hesitated, then spoke with reluctant precision. "If she took something that affected the heart," she said. "A medication in the wrong dose. It can start with nausea, sweating, tremor, then irregular rhythm, collapse." Judith's eyes narrowed. "You're suggesting she was poisoned." Arthur did not soften it. "I'm considering it." Judith's rings flashed as she lifted her hand. "If you are, then you must consider Sylvia first." Sylvia flinched as if struck. "I'm not considering anyone first," Arthur said. "I'm considering what the room tells me." He held up the forged note that Rose had kept. "And this," he added. "Who wrote it?" "Marian," Judith said instantly. Arthur's gaze stayed steady. "You were confident about her handwriting last night." Judith's lips tightened. "Because I've known her for decades." Arthur's eyes moved briefly to the letter in his other hand, then back to Judith. "So have the rest of you," he said. "And yet none of you saw her write it." That evening, with the storm raging and the house sealed, Arthur asked each woman to write a single sentence on a blank sheet of paper. Something simple, dictated so their hands could not choose words to disguise themselves. "Write, 'The sea is louder at night,'" he told them. Judith's eyes flashed. "This is humiliating." "It is," Arthur said calmly. "Please do it anyway." One by one they wrote. Clara's letters were thin and slanted, as if they might float away. Eleanor's were neat and faint, pressed too lightly. Sylvia's were practical, rounded, the handwriting of someone who filled charts. Judith's were bold and controlled. Arthur compared them silently to Marian's letter and to the forged note. He didn't need long to see what his instincts had already suggested. The note's capital M was formed with sharp angles. Marian's M was rounded, disciplined, but not aggressive. The note's lowercase r had a little hook at the end. Marian's did not. Judith's did. Arthur set the papers aside without comment, but the weight inside his chest shifted from uncertainty to direction. Chapter 6. The Timetable. In the small hours, the storm eased just enough for the house to hear itself again. The wind still pressed at the windows, but the rain became steadier, less violent. The sea's roar dropped by a fraction, and in that thin space of quiet, Arthur lay awake, the evidence replaying itself like testimony. 9:35 p.m., the time Marian had written at the top of her letter. If she was writing at 9:35, the timetable could not honestly place the evening's night tea at 9:10. Someone had altered it. Someone who wanted the house to believe Marian had been alone earlier than she was. Someone who wanted a gap. In the morning, Arthur stood in the hall and studied the timetable closely. The altered line read, 9:10 night tea, drawing room. But the 1 in 9:10 was too dark, the graphite pressed into paper with a confident hand. Beneath it, the faint indentation of a different number remained, a ghost pressed into the sheet. Arthur ran his thumb lightly over it and felt the ridge. 4. The original time had been 9:40. You changed it, Rose said behind him, her voice barely above the tick of the clock. Arthur turned. Rose stood in her dressing gown, hair loose, eyes serious. I read it yesterday, she said. When Marian pinned it up, it said 9:40. I remember because I teased her about being precise. Arthur nodded once. Thank you. Rose's gaze flicked to the keys. And the key. Arthur's eyes followed hers. It was warm, Rose whispered. When you took it, I saw you flinch. He didn't deny it. Rose hugged herself. Judith held it right before. Arthur's voice stayed low. She did. Rose's mouth tightened, so she knew Marian was dead before the rest of us did. Arthur considered that. Judith had opened the door in front of them. She had reacted in real time, but she had also kept her composure quickly, and she had been the one to insist on checking first. Or, Arthur said, she wanted to be seen discovering her. Rose's eyes widened slightly. Then she exhaled. What's in that letter? Arthur looked down at the writing room door, closed, the rim lock holding. A history, he said, and a threat. Later, when the women gathered in the drawing room, Arthur placed Marian's letter on the table between them, weighted with the heavy brass candlestick so no draught could steal it. Before I read this, he said, I want to explain something about the writing room. Judith's eyes narrowed. Must you? Yes, Arthur said, and went to the hall door to demonstrate. He opened the writing room door, stepped into the corridor, and pulled it shut. The rim lock clicked. He tried the handle. It did not open. The door was locked from the hall by the catch. He turned to the women. No key is needed to lock it, he said. Only to open it, Sylvia frowned. So someone could have left and simply closed the door behind them. Exactly, Arthur replied. A locked room, yes, but not an impossible one. Judith's rings clicked as she adjusted them, meaning your locked room tells us nothing. Arthur looked at her evenly. It tells us that the person who wanted it to look sealed only needed to pull the door shut. He returned to the table. Now, he said, to what Marian wrote at 9:35 last night. He read the first paragraph aloud. Marian's words were controlled and cold, written as if she were laying out evidence for court. She described a girls' training college in the late 1960s, a scholarship student, a missing examination paper, a whispered accusation that became a certainty because it was convenient for those who feared scrutiny. Lillian Shaw had been expelled. Marian wrote that Lillian had protested, begged, written letters that were never answered. Marian wrote of how the 5 women sitting in the room now, then young, ambitious, frightened, had agreed to a story and stuck to it. Marian wrote of how Lillian's family had left town under shame. And Marian wrote, in a line that bit, we were never friends. We were accomplices. Arthur looked up as he finished that sentence. Clara was crying silently, wiping tears with the back of her hand. Sylvia's face was gray. Eleanor stared at the fire, jaw clenched. Rose's eyes were wet, but her expression was fierce, more angry than shocked. Judith sat very still. Arthur read on. Marian had found recently a packet of letters, Lillian's letters, kept by someone who had finally tired of protecting secrets. Marian wrote that she had contacted each woman and invited them here under the lie of friendship. She wrote that she intended to publish the truth, names included. She wrote that she had offered them a choice, cooperate and make amends, or refuse and be exposed. At the bottom of the page, near the teacup ring, Marian's handwriting wavered. The last full line, partially smeared by the tea stain, read, Judith came in with Then the ink broke off as if Marian's hand had failed. Silence held the room. Arthur set the letter down. "This," he said softly, "is motive." Judith's lips parted as if to protest. Then she closed them again. Arthur held up the forged note. "And this is staging." He placed it beside Marian's letter. "Last night," he said, "a note appeared telling the house not to disturb Marian. Someone said Marian's handwriting was consistent, always reliable." He looked at Judith. "That remark was used to make you stop looking," he continued, "but it is false." He turned the forged note slightly so the light caught the strokes. "Marian's M is rounded," he said, tapping the letter at the top of Marian's page. "This M is sharp. Marian's R ends cleanly. This R hooks." He slid Judith's dictated sentence from the night before into view. "And Judith Crane," Arthur said, "hooks her R in exactly the same way." Judith's rings flashed as she clenched her hand. Arthur went on before she could speak. "The timetable in the hall originally listed night tea at 9:40, he said. "Rose remembers it. The paper remembers it too. The indentation of the original number is still there." He lifted the timetable and traced the faint ridge with his finger. "Someone erased the 4 and replaced it with a 1, Arthur said. "Someone wanted the house to believe Marian retired earlier than she did." Judith's mouth tightened. "Why would I care about a timetable?" Arthur's gaze remained steady. "Because Marian wrote the time at the top of her letter, 9:35. That time anchors the night." He tapped the letter. "At 9:35, he said, Marian was alive and writing. Sometime after that, she was interrupted. The teacup was set down on the page while the ink was still wet, staining and smearing it." He gestured to the ring. "That is not a mark made in the morning," he said. "It was made while she wrote, when the ink was fresh." Sylvia's brow furrowed. "So the tea came while she was writing?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, someone brought it." His eyes moved briefly to Mrs. Prowse, who stood near the door like a stern sentry. "The kitchen served no night tea," Arthur said. Mrs. Prowse confirmed it. He turned back to Judith. "You offered digestive drops?" he said. "You produced the bottle, Marian took it, and you knew her habits well enough to say 12 drops without being asked." Judith's voice came out sharp. "It's a common dose." "For those drops," Arthur said, "perhaps." He looked to Sylvia. "If a person took a heart medication in too high a dose, say drops meant for someone else, what would you expect?" Sylvia swallowed. "Nausea," she said quietly. "Tremor. Then irregular rhythm. Collapse. It could take an hour. More. Less. It depends." Arthur nodded. "An hour is enough." He let the words settle. "Marian wrote steadily at first," he said. "Then, near the end, her hand began to tremble. She was already feeling the effects." Judith's face was unreadable now, as if she had locked it behind her teeth. Arthur continued. "The writing room door," he said, "locks when it is pulled shut, no key needed, so a person could be with Marian, leave her alive, pull the door shut, and the room would appear sealed." Eleanor's voice came out thin. "But the key was on the hook." Arthur lifted it gently, and it was warm, he said, in a cold hall, which means it had been held recently. Rose's breath hitched. Clara stared at her lap. Sylvia's eyes flicked to Judith. Arthur looked directly at Judith now. "This morning," he said, "you insisted on checking first. You took the key. You opened the door. You saw Marian. You shut the door. Then you returned the key to the hook." Judith's jaw set. "You did it in front of us," Arthur said, "so we would all remember you as the discoverer, not as the person with the most reason to be the last visitor." Judith's voice was brittle. "That's ridiculous." Arthur's tone did not shift. "Then explain the altered timetable. Explain the forged note in your handwriting. Explain why Marian's final line begins with your name." Judith's hand moved, quick and instinctive, toward the letter. Arthur was faster. He covered it with his palm. Judith's eyes flashed with something ugly. Rage, fear, humiliation. For a moment, the drawing room felt too small to hold all of it. Then Judith laughed softly. "You always did like the sound of your own reasoning," she said, her voice edged. "A magistrate to the last." Arthur held her gaze. "And you always liked control." Judith's laugh died. Her fingers went to her rings, turning one once, twice, as though tightening a screw. "Do you know what Marian was going to do?" Judith said, and for the first time her composure cracked enough to show the heat beneath. "She was going to drag us through the mud in public. She was going to make a spectacle of it, not for justice, never that, for power." Eleanor flinched. "Judith, Don't, Judith snapped. Don't pretend you wanted the truth told. None of you did. Sylvia's eyes filled. We were young, she whispered. We were frightened. Judith's gaze cut to her. You were always frightened. Some of us had more to lose. Arthur watched the stormlit window, the sea's constant violence. So you killed her, he said simply. Judith's shoulders rose and fell once, a small surrender masked as irritation. I gave her what she asked for, Judith said quietly. She wanted drops, she wanted tea. She wanted to sit at her desk and write her little indictment. Rose's voice came out raw. You poisoned her. Judith's eyes slid to Rose, almost pitying. It wasn't dramatic, she said. It wasn't a knife in the dark. It was a correction. Arthur's voice stayed calm. What did you use? Judith's fingers tightened around her ring. My own prescription, she said after a beat. A heart medicine. In small doses it keeps me alive. In larger ones it doesn't. Sylvia's hand went to her mouth. Judith looked at Marian's letter on the table, the teacup ring staining it like a bruise. She drank it, Judith said softly. And then she sat there, writing as if she could make the past obey her ink. When she began to feel it, when her hand shook, she tried to write my name. She always did like to name the guilty. Her mouth twisted. She didn't finish. Clara's tears fell soundlessly. Eleanor stared at the fire as if she could burn the last 40 years out of it. Rose sat very still. And the note, she asked. Judith's eyes flicked to it, then away. So you wouldn't disturb her, she said. So no one would knock and find her before it was done. Arthur nodded once. And the timetable, he said. Judith's lip curled. So you'd argue about times instead of motives, so you'd doubt your own memory. Marian loved timetables. It felt appropriate. Arthur took a slow breath. Outside, the storm was easing. The rain was still falling, but less violently. In the quieting air, the house seemed to listen. Mrs. Prowse spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. When the lane clears, I'll get word to the village, she said, voice hard. They'll send the police. Judith did not react. Arthur stood. Until then, he said, you will remain where we can see you. Judith looked up at him. Her eyes were clear now. No fear, only something like tired contempt. Of course, she said. We always did keep an eye on one another. Chapter 7, The Sea at Dawn. The storm broke itself against the coast and at last began to tire. By late afternoon, the wind dropped into a steady, restless push. The rain softened into a drizzle that smelled clean instead of violent. Mrs. Prowse's niece returned from the upper lane with her cheeks flushed and her hair plastered to her head. The water's gone down, Lottie reported. The path is still a mess, but a man from the village is coming. He said he'll bring help. They waited. Judith sat in the drawing room with the others, watched by Arthur and Mrs. Prowse in turns. She did not attempt to flee. There was nowhere to go, and Judith Crane did not run into weather. Eleanor sat in a chair with her hands folded, smoothing her skirt now and then without realizing. Sylvia stared at her own palms as if she could wash guilt off skin. Clara sat by the window, charm pressed between her fingers like a prayer she no longer believed in. Rose moved quietly between them, offering tea that no one wanted. When the knock finally came, 3 firm beats on the front door. It sounded like a verdict. 2 men in waterproof coats entered, faces roughened by wind and work. One was the village constable, wet hair plastered to his forehead, boots leaving muddy prints on Marian's polished floor. Arthur explained what had happened with the calm clarity of someone used to speaking in rooms that decided fates. Judith listened without expression. When the constable reached for his notebook, Judith lifted her chin and said, I did it. The words were flat, not triumphant, not remorseful, only final. The constable's pen hovered, surprised by the ease of it. Arthur watched the women as the house shifted from private dread to official consequence. Eleanor's eyes closed. Sylvia began to cry in earnest now, silent tears shaking her shoulders. Clara's hands covered her mouth. Rose stared at Judith with a kind of exhausted fury. Was she really going to publish it? Rose demanded. Was she really going to drag all of it into the open? Judith's gaze slid to her. Yes, she said. And you know why? Because she liked the power of it. She liked seeing us sit there, older and softer, and realize she still had us. Rose's voice broke. And we let her. We let the past rot and thought it wouldn't smell. No one answered that, because there was nothing left to soften it. When the men led Judith away, the storm gave one last gust, rattling the windows as if the house resented losing its captive. Then the front door closed, and the sound of the sea returned to being only itself. Arthur went to the hall and looked at the key hook. The writing room key hung where it always had, brass dulled, label in Marian's hand still neat. Keys, he thought, were honest in their way. They did one thing. People did not. He stepped outside onto the small covered porch. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, and the wind was cool without being cruel. Far below, the sea still churned, but the horizon had begun to clear, a pale strip of light stretching out as if it might become a morning. Behind him, the women moved through the house like ghosts, each carrying her own portion of the past. Marian had invited them for friendship, but friendship had never been the point. Arthur watched the first thin brightness spread across the water and wondered, not for the first time, how many lives were ruined not by a single cruel act, but by the quiet agreement to say nothing at all.